We have already discussed some of the problems associated with wild collecting of insects. While traditionally people would collect a small amount of insects for personal or family use, today much insect collection is done in rural or forested areas to be sold to people in cities, or even exported, leading to overharvesting that could threaten wild populations, and maybe even drive these insects to extinction. Wild collecting also puts collectors into conflict with others, such as plant farmers or governments trying to protect and manage natural forests. There are other, more practical issues associated with collecting insects from the wild. First, many of these insects are seasonal, so they are not the best choice as a source of nutrition all year round. Collecting insects can be quite labor-intensive, like digging up cicada nymphs or poking agave worms out of the plants with thorns. As with wild fish, birds, and game, wild insects could also be infected with parasites, pathogens, or heavy metals, or exposed to pesticides and pollutants. Their quality will also vary. Some years you may get lots of plump, tasty insects, and other years not so much. Wild insect populations are also subject to the widespread problems of environmental damage. Deforestation, habitat loss, pollution, all are leading to fewer and fewer insects available for the collection, even without issues of overcollecting. The solution to these issues is farming. It's as true for plants and larger animals as it is for insects. When you farm, you can control the quality and quantity of the food you get, and potentially have it available all year round for a fraction of the time and effort needed to hunt or gather the food yourself. If insects are going to be a sustainable and significant component of people's diets, then they must be cultivated as much as possible. As a bonus, the higher yields for reduced resources means insect farming can be more profitable than insect collecting, and may be a better way to get people out of poverty. Finally, the environmentalist argument for eating insects, that they take less resources to produce than traditional agriculture, only makes sense when one is comparing farmed insects to farmed vertebrates. In Uganda, the cone-headed katydid called Nsenene has been a traditional part of the diet for centuries. Historically, women and children would collect these and give them to the men to eat. Women did not eat Nsenene because of the fear that it would cause their children to be born with cone heads too. Today, everyone loves them. In 2021, a meme spread across southern Africa showing a passenger on a Uganda Airlines flight from Dubai to Entebbe selling Nsenene mid-flight. Not appropriate under airline policy, but the other passengers seemed very happy to buy some. The contemporary way to collect Nsenene is with traps. Corrugated metal sheets leading to empty oil barrels are placed under extremely bright fluorescent lights overnight, catching the katydids with almost no effort. Twice a year, around November and May, is swarming season, and trappers will have been setting up their traps up to a month in advance to maximize their haul. Nsenene, besides being delicious and nutritious, is expensive and so valuable. In one season, a collector can make hundreds of US dollars in profits, which in Uganda's economy is a significant sum. Nsenene collectors can support their families, send their children to university, and use the remaining profits to grow their business even bigger. The problem with these traps is that they take a lot of electricity, and many of the Nsenene trappers aren't connected to the power grid. The electricity is being stolen, and this drain on the power grid causes blackouts and burst transformers every rainy season. Some cities in Uganda are paying millions of US dollars a year just to repair their electrical infrastructure. While the government is trying to educate people on this, there is no political will to enforce regulations on electricity when it's being used to get people out of poverty and bring prices down on a popular food. And unfortunately, Nsenene is attracting corruption, as some local authorities have been accused of confiscating the katydids while accusing the sellers of operating unauthorized businesses and demanding fines or bribes. Each year, more and more people set up Nsenene traps, and the trapping season starts earlier each year. The result is that the number of Nsenene is decreasing, especially since it is the winged adults that are caught, often before they have a chance to mate and lay eggs that would become the next generation. Already, the businessmen selling them and Ugandan scientists studying them are noticing the decline both in the numbers and even the size of the insects caught. On top of all this is climate change. Nsenene swarm during rainy season, and a combination of reduced forest cover and changing global temperatures has meant less rain, including areas where they used to be abundant. The grasslands where the katydids live during the dry season and lay eggs are also vanishing due to the spread of agriculture in cities. The locations and times of year where Nsenene can be caught are changing, and not for the best. Furthermore, as the areas where Nsenene can be caught become more remote, the collectors have to spend more and more money on fuel transporting them to the cities where they are sold, which reduces their profits. This sharp reduction in supply combined with increasing demand is only driving the prices for Nsenene up, making the traps even more profitable, but also pricing Nsenene out of reach for some people. It is unknown how many katydids can be sustainably harvested each year, or how to regulate the trapping season so that enough adults are left alive to maintain the generations. And even if we knew this information, getting people to observe such regulations is another matter. Imagine if Nsenene could be farmed. The demand for this insect is already high. You don't need to convince people in Uganda to eat it. Farming Nsenene could mean a reliable source of insects and income all year round, and would relieve pressure on wild populations. Would the farmed Nsenene be cheaper than the ones trapped for free with stolen electricity? Not necessarily. But if the wild populations continue to decline, eventually the farmed ones would be the better option, if farming them economically is even possible. Ugandan researchers at institutes like Makerere University in Kampala, plus other researchers in nearby Tanzania and Kenya, are already working on ways to farm Nsenene, feeding the young insects grains and grass to try to determine what foods they like, how much they need to eat, what temperature and humidity conditions are ideal, and what nutritional and even medicinal qualities the insects might have. The researchers are hopeful they can unveil commercial Nsenene farms soon, but time is running out. Not every animal, plant, or mushroom can be farmed. Organisms that have very specific ecological needs, like large areas to roam in, or specific symbioses with other creatures, or very strict growing conditions, or a very particular diet, just aren't conducive to agriculture. Some grasshoppers, for example, including many edible species like the migratory locust or Mexican chapulines, take months to mature and require fresh, living plants to eat. Farming them is not as practical as, say, farming something that eats hay. Somewhere between collecting and trapping organisms from the wild and growing or farming truly domesticated species in your property comes semi-natural cultivation, or semi-cultivating, also called semi-wild collecting. This is for organisms that cannot be farmed, but whose wild populations can be encouraged to grow in larger numbers than you would normally get if you did nothing. Semi-cultivation has been around for millennia. We have discussed the water bugs in Mexico, whose eggs were the foods of the Aztec emperors. These water bugs live in clean ponds and lay their eggs on certain plants at the edge of the water. They are hard to grow indoors because the nymphs are predatory and need to be fed mosquito larvae and snails. Plus, you need to change the water daily. Not worth the effort. Instead, by ensuring the ponds stay clean and unpolluted, and by planting more of the plants that the insects like, the Aztecs and their descendants today maintained larger populations of water bug than would occur naturally. Also in Mexico, our friend agave returns. Certain cultivars of agave are used to make a liquor called pulque, in which the 12-year-old plant is scraped to exude a sap called aguamiel that is then fermented. After scraping it, the plant dies and gets heavily infested by the agave weevil, whose larvae are edible. They're not commercialized, but they are an important source of protein for the rural pulque farmers. The weevil is a pest of healthy agave and would lower yields if it infests a plant destined for making mezcal. But when pulque farmers leave the dead plants available for the weevils, they are semi-cultivating the weevil in larger numbers than they would ever get if they just searched for the weevil in healthy plants. Motang, the red weaver ant in Thailand, is also semi-cultivatable. The ants build huge nests in mango trees, and raising these ants indoors has proven very difficult. Farming them just isn't practical. However, not only are the ants valuable as food, but also they protect the trees from herbivores, killing any caterpillars or other pests that would come to eat the mango leaves or mango fruits. So farmers love having these ants in their trees, and have figured out an ingenious way to encourage them. For the ants to move from one tree to another, they normally have to go down the tree and crawl across the ground, exposing them to a high risk of predators. By tying rope or cane from one treetop to another, farmers can make aerial highways for the ants, allowing them to colonize and travel between each tree in the plantation. It's win-win, as the ants get easy access to more territory, while the farmers get free pest control and delicious ant brood. Another Thai species that is semi-cultivated is the bamboo worm. It's a caterpillar, the larva of a moth that infests bamboo shoots. Every August, the adults lay eggs at the base of a bamboo shoot, and the larvae then chew their way into the bamboo. They will also prepare an exit hole for when they will become adults. The 50 or so larvae per shoot will chew their way through the plant, especially at the top near the growing points. Traditionally, a caterpillar collector would cut the whole bamboo clump down, break open every internode, and collect the larvae. However, after 2 months, the caterpillars mature, and then they all go back down to the bottom internode where they drill their exit hole and enter diapause. They wait in the caterpillar stage for 8 months, skipping the monsoons and the hot seasons until late spring, when they become pupae and eventually adults that emerge in July. Knowing this, the caterpillar collector can wait until all the caterpillars are down at the bottom, look for the internodes with the entry and exit holes the caterpillars made, and collect them all at once, saving the rest of the plant as bamboo. Because bamboo caterpillars need to live inside living bamboo, at this point in time one can't really farm them the way one would a cow, because one can't just give them shredded bamboo and expect them to eat it. However, by releasing caterpillars deliberately into the bamboo every summer, a bamboo farmer could encourage the infestations and ensure a bigger caterpillar harvest later. As a bonus, the bamboo itself will actually grow stronger and thicker if it is infested with caterpillars, making it better suited for heavy-duty tasks like scaffolding or construction. So by deliberately infesting their plants, the bamboo farmer both produces a higher quality bamboo and a tasty crop of caterpillars. Finding the right food for animals is essential for farming them. The mopane and shea caterpillars of Africa respectively prefer mopane and shea. You could collect these leaves and feed it to them in a box, but that's a little more expensive than just going out and collecting the caterpillars from trees. Scientists are investigating what aspect of the leaves is actually important for these insects, with the hope of finding an alternative food source. Maybe there is an odorant chemical in shea leaves, for example, that the shea caterpillars love, and so spraying this smell on cheaper leaves would make them an alternative food source. Or maybe there is a compound that they taste, so mixing a little shea with a cheaper artificial diet would work. Or perhaps the caterpillars cannot survive if not fed their favorite food, and can never be fully cultivated. We will figure this out with time. When you think of domesticated insects, the silkworm and the honeybee come to mind, and we will get to them later. For edible insect farming, one of the most widely grown is the cricket. Crickets are related to grasshoppers, locusts, and katydids in the class Orthoptera, from which many edible species come. Crickets generally have a shorter life cycle, meaning you can get multiple generations per year. And they are omnivores. While they mostly eat plants, you can give them an artificial diet, and they not only will survive, but thrive. The techniques to farm crickets at commercial scales were developed in Khon Kaen University in Thailand, and first taught to local schools there. Kids in these rural areas would grow the crickets as part of their education, and then eat them as part of their lunch. From these beginnings, the technique spread globally. The most commonly reared cricket is Achaeta domesticus, the common house cricket. As the name suggests, they like growing indoors, and they also produce the most eggs and are generally seen as the most tasty. Other species of cricket can also be farmed. The cricket containers come in several forms. Cheap and durable are concrete cylinders, normally used as drainage pipes. One person can manage 20 or 30 of them easily, but the disadvantage is once built, they cannot easily be moved. Large concrete block pens use space more efficiently, but there is a higher risk of overcrowding, and diseases can spread through the population rapidly. Plywood boxes are cheap, easy to clean, but not as durable. They are usually kept 15 to 20 centimeters off the ground to keep moisture and ants away. Finally, plastic drawers take little space and are easy to move, and can be kept on shelves 3 to 4 high to maximize use of space, though they may need replacing from time to time. Just be warned, the insects in the top shelf are at a risk of overheating, which weakens the cricket's immune system. In these containers, you put rice husks or egg cartons as bedding, so the crickets have a higher surface area to crawl around on. Damp tissue or plastic water bottles provide water, and mosquito netting or oil-soaked paper keeps the crickets in and possible predators out. Some farms have an oil-filled moat around the containers to keep ants away. The feed is typically commercial chicken feed, which is easily the highest expense on the farm, from 1/3 to 2/3 of the production costs. For the first 20 days, you give the crickets a 21% protein feed, then switch to a lower protein diet afterwards. In the final days before harvest, farmers will typically switch to a whole food diet like pumpkins, cassava leaves, papaya, or watermelon to give the crickets a better flavor for a lower price. Take care that the feed and water are free of contaminants like mold or heavy metals, respectively, that the containers get neither too hot nor too cold, and avoid overcrowding, as this weakens the crickets and makes them susceptible to diseases like the cricket denso virus. Similarly, keep records of what food you're giving them and who has entered the facility and when, so that if something goes wrong, you can identify the cause and do something about it. The crickets will grow from little nymphs to adults in around 40 days. And then it's mating season. The same day you start hearing singing, put in a bowl of egg-laying material like soil or sand for the females to lay eggs in. Farmers will often sell these bowls of eggs to other farmers to help ensure the genetic diversities of the farms and prevent inbreeding depression. The egg bowls are moved to a separate breeding tank and kept for 7 to 10 days, after which the eggs will hatch. A large-scale cricket farm can thus be set up with very little space and run by very few people. And these are typically how cricket farms in Southeast Asia look. If you have the land and resources, however, a large climate-controlled warehouse with modular robotic-controlled containers is also possible, as may be seen in cricket farms in Canada and the USA. The products include the crickets, obviously, which can be sold for human or pet food. Most of the cricket farms in the West started selling them for reptile food, though the many possible uses of crickets in human food are making some companies pivot in that direction. The waste of the crickets, their frass, can also be sold as a fertilizer, much like cow manure. A lot of the information on cricket farming is available today, though it's still a challenge to set up a commercially viable farm. New farmers may not know the best practices for breeding management, nutrition, pest control, farm hygiene, or the marketing of their products. As the industry grows, the informal network of farmers will be boosted with extension workers and technical staff to provide training, and government agencies to help farmers with trade issues and to monitor possible disease outbreaks among the farms, similar to what is already available for livestock farming. Palm weevils are beetle pests of palm trees, such as coconut, sago, raffia, date, and oil palm. The adults lay eggs at the crown of the tree, where it is hardest for humans and our pest control measures to reach, and the hatching larvae bore into the soft parts of the tree, causing much damage and possibly killing the tree. Because they are pests, farming them is illegal or restricted in many parts of the world to protect important palm industries. In many areas, however, they are a valuable food source. The larvae grow to be quite large, and after about a month, they leave the tree to pupate. Thus, it only takes about a month to go from eggs to edible larvae, which are sweet and fatty, and with more minerals, as much protein, and less cholesterol than beef. The beetle is a traditional food in tropical Asia, Africa, and the Amazon, where people find dead or dying trees, cut them down, and take the wood apart to find the larvae. The story of beetle farming once again begins in Thailand, but this time the south, where palms are native. The cabbage palm, whose leaves are used in crafting, and the sago palm used to produce food, would naturally be infested with these weevils. People would keep such palms on their property just to have insects for home consumption. Only around the late 1990s to 2000s did commercial weevil farming become popular, and has since expanded throughout Thailand. Weevil farming is possible because, while the weevils are dependent on palm trees, they don't need the wood to be alive. There are two main ways to farm palm weevils. The first is to take a palm stem and cut it into 50 centimeter lengths, then drill 10 holes 5 centimeters deep. To each of these, you release 5 male and 5 female adult beetles, cover the top with shredded palm, and water it twice a day. The adults will lay eggs, and in over a month, the larvae will mature and be ready to harvest. You can then reuse the logs for the next generation before you need to harvest a new one. The yield for each fragment of palm stem is going to be greater than that of an entire tree infested naturally. The second technique uses plastic containers, filled with a mixture of shredded palm and commercial pig feed. It's a bit more expensive, but the high nutrient quality of the feed means the larvae develop faster, and the plastic containers can be stacked in shelves, meaning this system requires less space. In both cases, a farmer is able to produce large amounts of weevils on their own property all year round, and far fewer trees have to be cut down, since every inch of palm stem gets utilized by the weevils, unlike in nature where there is no guarantee a damaged tree will have many insects at all. The manure of the weevils can be sold as fertilizer, and the chubby grubs can be sold directly to the consumer or to a wholesaler. They are already used as reptile feed. As human food, they can be steamed, grilled, fried, or eaten raw, straight from the palm tree, still wiggling. Why not? All they eat is palm stalk, so they are quite clean. In the 2010s, the Thai methods of weevil farming were brought to Africa, to Ghana, Cameroon, and the Congo Basin. For communities that live in the forests, traditional palm weevil collecting is a substantial source of income. But it is unsustainable due to the large number of trees cut down and has an irregular weather-dependent yield. It is also very slow, as collectors have to spend days in the forest to harvest enough grubs to sell. Semi-cultivation, where trees are deliberately infested, has higher but still relatively low yields, and requires the trees be visited frequently to ensure they are successfully infested. The farming system produces 5 to 10 times more grubs than wild collecting or semi-cultivation from the same amount of palm stems, thus protecting the threatened raffia ecosystems, and it can be done all year round, and it requires far less time spent in the snake-filled forest. Also important, the quality and taste of the farmed larvae is exactly the same as wild-caught. The introduction of palm grub farming techniques to places like Cameroon can thus significantly improve the livelihoods of local people and promote community-based conservation, in which the local people profit from the protection of their forests. One of the most accessible and certainly easiest insects to farm is the mealworm, which is the larva of the darkling beetle. This species was not a traditional part of the diet of any culture, but they are a popular edible insect now because farming them is so very easy. As the name suggests, the mealworm is a traditional pest of milled grains, and that's exactly how you grow them. In any container, put down a shallow layer of oatmeal or wheat bran. Don't use whole grains or fine milled flour. Add a slice of carrot or potato once or twice a week, which is just enough moisture for the larvae without getting the substrate wet and moldy. Then, add larvae and wait. Sprinkle a little chicken feed if you want to give them a nutrient boost. After as little as 3 months, if food, temperature, and humidity are right, the mealworms become pupae and stay in that stage for a few weeks until they become adults. If you want to harvest, just sift the larvae out before they become pupae, and voila, mealworms. If you put the whole system in the refrigerator, you can slow development and prevent pupation for months as needed. The frass, or waste, can be used as fertilizer once you made sure any eggs in the frass have hatched out. All 4 life stages, egg, larva, pupae, adult, can be kept in a single container. However, as adults and larvae will occasionally eat pupae or eggs, many mealworm farms use a tiered system, a vertical series of trays that are rotated to keep different age and stage insects apart. The top bin contains the adults, and the bottom of this bin will be replaced with a fine mesh. The adults lay hundreds of tiny eggs on this mesh, which hatch in about 2 weeks. The hatchlings literally fall into the next bin, and so this bin can be rotated out with any other bins to keep the smaller larvae away from the larger ones and make harvesting easier. Pupae will also be moved to a separate pupal bin, and when the adults emerged, they go right up to the top. Note that the adult beetles are not edible. They are chemically defended, so if you see adult mealworms in your oatmeal, it's time to throw it out. Besides their simple diet, another benefit of mealworms is that they love being close together. While other animals and certain insects like crickets get stressed or sick when close together, mealworms actually thrive in crowded conditions and will always try to gather together as much as possible. The more cramped, the better. That means a mealworm farm can be highly productive in a small space, with stacks upon stacks of mealworm boxes on top of each other. As long as you keep them in darkness and don't let them overheat or dry out, the insects will thrive. Today, large-scale commercial mealworm farms are producing them at industrial scales. A company in the Netherlands can produce 2.5 kilograms of mealworms every 10 weeks, using computers to control humidity. Because mealworm farming takes so little space, and since mealworms don't fly and don't smell bad, it's actually very easy to raise them indoors, even in your own kitchen. The common mealworm, Tenebrio molitor, is not the only mealworm. The lesser mealworm is a scavenger that can also eat chicken manure, chicken eggs, and chicken corpses. That means it can be used in chicken farms, eating the waste of the chickens and then being fed right back to the hens, closing the nutrient loop and greatly improving the sustainability of chicken farming. The superworm, Zophobus morio, is a larger species that is a little harder to farm than yellow mealworm, as they need to be kept apart to pupate, take longer to grow, and can bite. You may sometimes see giant mealworms, which are not a separate species, but rather regular mealworms exposed to juvenile hormone, an insect hormone that causes them to grow an extra larval stage instead of becoming a pupa. They are perfectly safe to eat, as the hormone has no effect on vertebrates. Waxworms are not beetles, but moth larvae, so named because the larvae are parasites of beehives, where they tunnel into the comb and eat the stored food. You can raise these like mealworms in a single, deep container with a mesh lid. The diet will be a mixture of grains, honey, and glycerin. Adults are allowed to develop completely, and balls of wax paper inside are the substrate on which they lay eggs. These insects are most commonly farmed as food for chickens, fish, reptiles, and any insect-eating pets. You can thus get bags of mealworms easily at pet shops. So if you want to try edible insects but live in a country that doesn't have an entomophagy tradition, these are probably your best option. Dried mealworms are crispy with a nutty flavor, so they are commonly used similarly to peanuts. Add them to cookies or brownies and serve them to your adventurous friends. They will be surprised how innocuous insects are. Internationally, edible insects is a growing market. In 2018, the USA insect protein market was expected to reach 50 million by 2023. Projections at the start of the 20th century were that the global edible insect market would grow 24% per year, reaching almost $8 billion by 2030. Between 2015 and 2020, we saw an exponential increase in capital going to insect farming, from 10 million to over 400 million US. Many people are seeking their fortunes in six-legged food. Some of the big names in insects for food or feed as of 2020 are the Aspire Food Group, Insect, AgriProtein, Protix, Entomofarms, Kreka Entofood, etc. The biggest companies are currently in the Netherlands, South Africa, France, Canada, and the USA, each company worth tens to hundreds of millions of US dollars. The main driver for this increase in Western markets is the environmentalist argument. Founders of edible insect companies receive money not just from venture capitalists, but also philanthropy-minded investors. Their companies are seen not only as food and drink companies, but also as social entrepreneurship. The main driver in developing economies is the sheer demand for these insects. In Thailand, demand for insects is so high that many are being imported from nearby countries. A Thai farmer who invests in an insect farm, either as their primary source of income or as a supplement to, say, rice farming, is very likely to make profits, sometimes going quite literally from poverty to wealth. Today, there are well over 20,000 cricket farms in Thailand, 60% of which are run by women. On average, a cricket farmer can make 500 to 750 kilograms of crickets every 45 days, for an annual profit in 2020 prices of about 30 to 350,000 Thai baht a year, double the average wages. What do farmers need to maximize their profits? 1. Reduced feed costs. For cricket farmers that use chicken feed, the cost of inputs are considerable. 2. Better access to markets. Once you have your crickets, where do you sell them? To whom? At what price? In Thailand, cricket farming cooperatives have sprung up, where the farmers in the village pool their harvests and bargain collectively with wholesalers, ensuring that they get higher prices than if they competed against each other. 3. Value-added products. Whole insects have a limited market, especially if they are fresh and spoil quickly. But if farmers can convert their insects into a product, and maybe find a way to preserve it for a longer shelf life, they can charge a higher price, appeal to more consumers, and be less dependent on seasonal harvests. We have focused so far in insects as food for humans, but insects can be food for animals too. Crickets and mealworms have long been farmed as food for insectivorous reptiles, as pets and in zoos. And newer companies are starting to make pet foods for dogs and cats out of insects. The bigger market, however, is using insects as feed for livestock, poultry, swine, and fish in fish farms. The use of insects as feed is actually a far larger market than the use of insects as human food. And remember that many animals naturally have insects as part of their diet, like chickens and freshwater fish. Livestock feed is a significant portion of the cost of raising animals, both financially and environmentally. Large tracts of land are needed to grow hay, alfalfa, and corn, not for human consumption, but to feed the animals that we eat. Around 80% of the world's soy is grown not for humans, but for animals to eat. as soy meal is a critical ingredient in many animal feeds. Another major ingredient is fish meal, made from ground-up fish. World fisheries are being depleted at an alarming rate, and the cost of fish meal is going up. For fish farmers and other people involved in aquaculture, the rising costs of fish meal, already surpassing $2,000 a ton, are eating away at their profits. Humanity needs a cheap and environmentally friendly alternative to soy meal and fish meal. Enter insects. Insects can be farmed with less land than soy, and obviously with no pressure on global fisheries, and provide equivalent nutrition to soy meal and fish meal. Since the animals won't have any negative cultural association with insects, they obviously need no convincing to eat insects the way humans do. As a bonus, depending on the animal the insects are being fed to, we can use different species of insects and different feeds for the insects themselves than what we would use for insects destined as human food. For example, you can take chicken manure and slaughterhouse waste, feed it to houseflies, and then feed these flies to the chickens. The chickens love it, as fly larvae are natural food for chickens. The farmers love it because it reduces the cost of feed and the cost of waste disposal. Environmentalists love it because it closes the nutrient loop. The waste of one part of the cycle becomes food for another, similar to how cow manure is used as plant fertilizer. The benefit of eliminating the waste itself is significant. Waste disposal is a major cost for any society. Garbage trucks and incinerators need fuel, sanitation workers need salaries, landfills need space. Depending on where in the world you live, food, kitchen, and garden waste can represent a large portion of the total waste. The EU alone makes nearly 100 million tons of garden and kitchen waste every year. Also a problem are organic side streams, the waste from human food production, like vegetable and fruit peels, spent grains from brewing, and press cakes from oil, sugar, and cider production, etc., etc. Globally, 1/3 of all food is thrown out, a horrible waste when you consider world hunger, but also a shame. It means 1/3 of all the effort and resources farmers put into making food is lost. Plus, all that waste needs to go somewhere, and someone is paying to dispose of it. Some governments have composting plants or systems where food waste is used as pig feed, but the majority of this waste worldwide is either landfilled or burned, wasting the organic nutrients within it, polluting the environment, and pumping carbon into the atmosphere. Instead, these wastes can be fed to insects, who will process it more efficiently than pigs, and much more quickly than composting. As feed, the resulting insect biomatter is more valuable than compost. The waste goes from being a drain in resources to being an economically valuable product. Bioconversion of waste into feed through insects solves the problems of waste, including waste from plant-based food production, and the problems of animal feed simultaneously. We may never be able to convince all of humanity to eat less meat, but we can use insects fed on organic side streams and wastes as the feed for these animals, thus reducing both the environmental footprint of the meat and the footprint of the plants, recycling nutrients and using resources efficiently, and boosting the profits of farmers and food producers. Everyone wins, but there's a catch. Not all insects can thrive on waste. For example, while certain types of food waste can be fed to crickets, the yield will be lower and the cricket mortality will be higher than those fed commercial chicken feed. Food waste may need to be processed somewhat to ensure it has enough resources for the insects themselves to thrive. Though how much of this is necessary depends on whether you are more concerned with disposing of the waste or producing feed. In all cases, the potential for insects as bioconversion tools is immense, and countries and companies in every continent have been taking notice. Of all the possible feed insects, the one with the biggest potential at the moment is the black soldier fly, Hermetia lucens, often referred to as BSF. The larvae of this species will consume almost any organic waste: manure, compost, corpses, leaf litter, and of course, every kind of food waste. They are ravenous feeders, consuming twice their body weight in food every day. In the process, they can also eat and destroy certain microbial pathogens and chemical contaminants in the feed, making whatever substrate they don't eat safer for disposal. The BSF larvae also outcompete other flies, like the disease-spreading houseflies. Unlike houseflies, the harmless and mostly non-feeding adult BSF are not particularly attracted to human food, and so do not vector human diseases. From a waste management perspective alone, BSF can be extremely useful. The bonus is that they are edible. The final instar larvae, called prepupae, or the pupae, can be used as food or feed. You can directly feed these to birds or fish, who will be happy for the treat, or grind them up into BSF meal or press them into BSF oil. The defatted BSF protein is comparable to soy meal and fish meal, and the oil comparable to fish oil or plant oil, providing sustainable alternatives to these critical feed ingredients. BSF can be eaten by humans and processed into people foods, including a dairy substitute that can be used to make insect-based butter and ice cream. But the biggest market for BSF is still as animal feed. The simplest way to farm BSF or any other waste-breeding fly like the housefly is to simply lay the waste out in a shallow area, let it get infested with flies, wait for the larvae to develop, and then strain them out. In this method, 60% of the organic matter is eliminated in around 10 days. This easy method is already in use by fish and poultry farmers in certain areas. The waste of meat production is used to produce larvae, fed right back to the animals. To produce BSF from waste in a more controlled environment, maximizing waste removed and/or fly biomatter produced, there are other technologies, and the information is freely available online in several languages. As adults, these harmless flies rarely if ever feed. They mate and lay their eggs in cracks or crevices on a surface near a source of waste. You will need to provide adults with space to fly and plenty of light if you want them to lay eggs. In farms, strips of wood or other surfaces are provided to the adults for them to lay eggs. You can buy commercial egg holders or make your own cheaply. The eggs hatch and the larvae literally fall down onto the substrate below, where they eat and grow. As long as moisture levels are between 45 to 75%, they will be happy. Keep these in the dark and turn the substrate as needed. Depending on the system, you may want to control temperatures. One small-scale BSF farm I visited used water-filled tubes and computer systems to control the temperature of the substrates. Depending on the ambient temperature and the quality of the feed, the larvae will eat and grow and mature within as little as 18 days. And then, as prepupae, they enter what's called the wandering phase. They will leave the substrate to find a new place to pupate. As a farmer, all you need to do is provide some sort of ramp for the larvae to crawl out on, and the insects will literally self-harvest at the right moment. Alternatively, simply use a sieve to separate the large maggots from the undigested substrate and insect frass, which itself can be used as fertilizer. The prepupae or pupae should then be washed and can be sold directly to the final consumer to be used as live animal feed or processed by shredding, milling, boiling, freeze-drying, etc., depending on the final product desired. To maintain a colony, save some pupae for around 15 days, and the adults will emerge to continue the cycle. There are countless different ways to make a BSF farm, be it a small one on your property made from household materials, or an industrial-sized facility built to process tons of food waste and produce larvae at a commercial scale. Given their prospects and the relative simplicity of the technology, BSF is expected to be the third most economically important insect in the world after the honeybee and silk moth. Given the tremendous potential of black soldier fly, a lot of academic research has been done on this species, and plenty of research still needs to be done. Much of this has focused on the ways to scale up BSF production from small to industrial scales, and to optimize farming to maximize the amount of substrate consumed and/or insect biomatter produced, depending on whether waste disposal or feed production is the primary goal of the farm. How much light and space is really needed for the adults to mate? What kind of egg collectors are best? What is the ideal ratio of substrate to larvae for each type of food waste? And what effects do different wastes have on the yield and nutritional value of the larvae that eat them? We know that the BSF's diet will affect their growth, survival, and nutrition significantly, and that certain organic wastes may need to be combined with others to maximize fly production. Other researchers have looked at the effect BSF have on the animals that eat them. Can they really be used to replace soy or fish meal? I can tell you that for fish and chickens, the answer is yes. 100% of the fish meal in commercial fish or poultry feed, though less than 100% in swine feed, could be replaced with BSF meal, with no effects whatsoever on the palatability of the food to the animals that eat it, no negative effects on their health and development and yield, and importantly, no negative effects on the nutritional value, appearance, texture, smell, or taste of the meat or eggs produced from them. One study with taste testers actually found that eggs from BSF-fed hens had a better flavor than those fed fish meal. Researchers with a mechanical engineering background are looking into the processing aspect of BSF. What kind of machines can best handle large amounts of fly larvae? What order of operations, from cooking to shredding to powdering to pasteurizing, is best to produce the highest quality product with the best nutrition and flavor? Other researchers are looking at new applications of BSF reared on food waste other than as food or feed. The exoskeleton is a source of chitosan, most of which today is produced from shrimp and crustacean shells, and which has many current and potential industrial uses, as a bioplastic, as an antifungal biopesticide, and in cosmetics. The oil from pressed BSF can also be used in cosmetics, or converted into biodiesel through transesterification or other processes. Thus, BSF can help convert food waste into biofuel more efficiently than processing the waste directly. An important class of BSF research looks at safety. What happens when you give BSF feed contaminated with microbes, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, natural toxins? Interestingly, BSF do not accumulate heavy metals, aflatoxin, or pesticides, and can destroy many microbes and degrade certain chemicals when they consume them. Thus, BSF can be used to decontaminate certain wastes, while producing a product safe for consumption. In Europe and the USA, there are limitations on what kind of waste can be fed to BSF, and what kind of animals BSF can be fed to, in order to keep certain pathogens out of the food supply, most notably mad cow disease. As the safety testing continues, more and more evidence becomes available to create fact-based guidelines on the kind of waste that can be fed to BSF, with the hope being that more and more classes of waste can be put into BSF bioconversion instead of being landfilled or incinerated. Finally, BSF isn't the only bioconversion insect being studied. BSF is found all over the world, but different varieties or strains of the species may have different properties than others. There are other soldier flies and other families of fly that can be reared on waste, and certainly cockroaches can be reared on some wastes too. Yes, cockroach farming does exist, and it's not very complicated at all. A building kept dark at high humidity and at least 20 degrees Celsius with kitchen waste as feed and maybe a large vacuum to harvest the roaches. Cockroach farming is most common in China, where the roaches can be used as animal feed similar to BSF, but most are powdered and used as an ingredient in medicine. But that's a story for a later lecture. Does a farmer love their animals? Even if they are raising animals for the purpose of eating them or giving them to another animal to eat, many farmers do care somewhat about the welfare of their livestock. This is both a matter of ethics as well as good business sense. When animals are grown in good conditions, they grow better and reach larger sizes. What's good for the animal is usually good for the farmer. It thus makes sense to consider animal welfare, even for farmed insects, if only as a means to maximize yields. Important tenets of animal welfare include the 5 freedoms: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from pain and discomfort, freedom to express their natural behavior, freedom from injury and disease, and freedom from fear and distress. All of these can directly translate into the yield of the farm and the quality of its final product. Animals that don't get enough food or water will reach a lower body size, reproduce less, and may die. Injury and disease obviously are harmful for animals, but pain, fear, and stress can also affect the animal's health and lead to reduced yields, reduced reproduction, and poor quality. Animals that cannot express their natural behavior may not grow to full size, may not mate properly, or may be stressed. In the context of insects, it's worth noting that every species has their own requirements. What's good for the cricket isn't necessarily good for the cockroach. Obviously, insect farmers need to ensure their insects get enough nutrients to survive and thrive. These ideal ratios are not hard to achieve, but take trial and error to discover, and some farmers may be guarding their secrets for the best feed combinations. Sanitation is critical to keep out dangerous pathogens. Large farms may want to invest in air filters, and feed certainly needs to be stored well to keep fungi from growing in it. Employees may need to wear gloves and face masks and hairnets, as much to keep them from contaminating the farm as for their own protection. Humidity needs to be controlled. Too moist and insects may get moldy, and larvae can drown in pools of water. Too dry and insects won't molt properly and will die. Temperature is critical. Too cold and insects won't develop fast enough, but too hot and they get ill and die. For most insects, temperatures between 25 to 27 degrees Celsius will do, but you may want to provide a gradient so insects can move from cold to warm areas as they please. Light is also important. Some insects use light and dark cycles to time their development. Others live in total blackness as larvae, but fly to the light as adults. The good news is that insects do not need much light, and some cannot see colors like red or green, so using a colored light you can monitor your farm without exposing them to bright lights. Population size needs to be considered. For crickets, high densities weaken their immune system and lead to overheating or cannibalism. But for locusts, their immune system is stronger at higher densities. The sex ratio might be important. In crickets, too few females for each male could lead to fighting. Providing sufficient space is needed for insects not to step on each other, except for mealworms who prefer being crowded. And space is critical for insects like adult black soldier flies that need to fly to mate. Adding egg cartons, wooden planks, strips of paperboard, etc. can increase the surface area for insects to climb on without requiring more space. Finally, there is the question of slaughter. How do you kill massive amounts of insects? This may sound like a first world problem, and in a way it is. Traditionally, edible insects are usually killed by tossing them to hot water or oil and cooking them, often after their legs and wings have been ripped off or their guts squeezed out. However, in the Western world, we see a growing concern among consumers and farmers about providing their insects with a good death. Boiling, frying, and asphyxiation with carbon dioxide gas are probably not the most humane methods. Freezing insects is popular and is what many consumers prefer. The idea is that cold-blooded insects fall asleep before they die. In reality, freezing is quite slow. The most painless method to kill insects is actually to shred them. At their small scale and using a large enough grinder, insects can be reduced to powder in a fraction of a second, before any pain signals could reach what used to be their brain. I would argue that this is the most humane way to kill a large amount of insects, though it only works if the machine is functioning well, the insect can be cooked or sterilized post-grinding, and the desired final product doesn't need to be whole. If the thought of grinding insects doesn't appeal to you, you could always eat them the way birds and fish and reptiles do. Pop them into your mouth while they are still alive, and chew them as nature intended. Insects are a great source of protein and calories, but not everyone needs more of those. Overnutrition and obesity are a problem in much of the world. The people who stand the most to gain from insect protein, besides perhaps bodybuilders, are those suffering protein deficiency. This is a separate issue from starvation. In many regions of the world, people have food, but it's mostly grain, enough to stave off death, but not enough for children to develop properly. If they do have access to protein, including insect protein, it's temporary, as lack of refrigeration means meat spoils quickly. Farmed, processed insect protein can help. A study in Mexico found that by mixing insect flour with corn flour in regions where corn was often one of the few foods available, the resulting tortillas would not only have enough protein for people to thrive, but also had unique flavors, depending on which insects were used. A similar study in the Lake Victoria region of Africa found that termites and lake flies, processed into forms like crackers, muffins, sausages, and meatloaf, were well accepted by the locals in both appearance and flavor. In Burkina Faso, the company Faso Pro focuses on making packages of dry shea caterpillars and caterpillar powder with a long shelf life, up to 18 months. The presently unfarmable caterpillar is only available fresh from July to September, but Faso Pro's products, packed in a sterile environment, can provide pregnant women and children with critical nutrients all year round, safely, while also increasing the income for the shea collectors, themselves also predominantly women, by over 50%. Give someone cricket flour and they will eat for a day. Teach them to farm crickets and they will eat for a lifetime. Because insect farming requires so little land and fewer resources than farming other animals or even plant proteins, insect farms can be cheaply set up by people who could never afford a cow farm or who could never be allowed cow farms due to cultural reasons. Insect farming thus enables food self-sufficiency and a source of income for individuals who do not own land, who do not own refrigerators, who do not have access to stores and other infrastructure, and particularly women. Of the over 20,000 cricket farms in Thailand, more than 60% are run and operated by women. Both insect collecting and farming in the developing world have been linked to female empowerment, giving women control over their funding and food. The major economic successes of insect farming in Thailand has inspired other governments and NGOs to promote edible insects as a tool for development and fighting poverty, in addition to malnutrition. The Flying Food Project is a project by the Netherlands government to set up cricket farming, processing, retail, and marketing businesses in Kenya and Uganda. In Ghana, the Aspire Food Group set up the first commercial palm weevil farms, providing free equipment and training to over 500 farmers. In Vietnam, the company Cricket One had the following business model. Cricket farms that fit into 12.2-meter climate-controlled containers were provided to farmers, along with training and the first crickets at no charge. The farmers use cassava leaves that would otherwise be thrown away, and the company takes the crickets and converts them into saleable flour. Everyone shares in the profits. In Laos, the government's Edible Insect Demonstration Unit brings gifted students from poor and rural areas to the capital city, Vientiane, where they are taught cricket rearing among other agricultural techniques. They then bring that knowledge home to share with their communities. Veterinarians Without Borders set up 16 cricket farms in Laos with materials, crickets, training in farming and marketing techniques, plus knowledge on how to make value-added products like cricket chili paste. In a follow-up study, they found that the farmers ate about 20 to 30% of their crickets, selling the rest or giving them away as gifts. The farmers were so appreciative of the impact of the insect that they erected a statue of a cricket in their town. In Colombia, a unique program was set up in which former FARC combatants were trained as black soldier fly farmers. The flies are fed locally generated waste and are used as feed for smallholder livestock farmers, while their waste is used as fertilizer. The communities thus become less reliant on imported animal feed or plant fertilizer, and these ex-combatants are reintegrated into their communities, providing them with both income and a purpose, and helping maintain the peaceful and inclusive societies desired in post-conflict Colombia. The takeaway from all of this is that while it's nice that people in wealthy nations are showing interest in eating insects for culinary and environmental reasons, the people who stand the most to benefit are those in regions with food insecurity, malnutrition, and poverty. It is in these areas where insect industries will provide the biggest gains.